Great. Thank you, Stephen, for that excellent presentation. Also to Paul and Hakeem for their excellent presentations. I'm Emorie Beck. I am a postdoc at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine and Medical Social Sciences. And I'll be talking today about how we measure and model idiographic persons and nomothetic populations and personality. But I think that if you watched my colleagues' talks previously, you'll see that these issues are broadly applicable outside of personality across pretty much every domain of psychology. So with that, let's kind of dive in. So whenever we talk about personality, it's kind of great to go back to like the starting point. And from its inception, the study of personality has kind of really, I guess, started with these two broad goals. One of which is this nomothetic approach, which examines the structure of individual differences within a population, or how individual or people differ from one another on these kind of rank-ordered dimensions. And the goal is basically to find these shared characteristics that do differentiate people from one another. But the alternative, this idiographic approach, seeks not to differentiate people from one another, but to understand an individual in their own right. So in this case, rather than trying to define the structure of personality in the population, you're trying to define the structure or the kind of functioning of a person relative to only him or herself. And this has a great kind of, application as well, because rather than kind of like trying to get at these common units or these common dimensions, we can just ask the person or look at what is actually central to this person. But I think rather than thinking of these as two goals of personality, I think it's better to kind of think of them at two levels of aggregation, two ways in which we kind of approach the measurement and modeling of psychological phenomena. And I think it's also useful to then place this kind of third level as a kind of intermediary within person level, where we might assume some of the processes, we might assume some of the variables are shared, but perhaps that people differ in the way that they unfold over time. And then I think once I got to this point and thinking about this kind of conceptual project, that then we have to kind of also think about the questions that we as scientists kind of, address more broadly. And there's pretty good consensus in the scientific community that we all typically address three kinds of questions. Descriptive questions that are kind of looking at these more kind of observational effects, understanding how phenomena look, how we would measure them, and so on. Predictive questions where we're trying to predict either some sort of population level difference or some sort of future phenomena. And then finally, explanatory questions. We're actually trying to kind of get at some of these causal elements, understand how something actually unfolds and why it unfolds a specific way. And when we start thinking about our types of research as broken down into these levels of aggregations and these questions that we ask, you also start to learn that some of these different types of questions may apply differently or may be applied differently across these different levels of aggregation. And one of the biggest kind of divides with this, Stephen actually partially touched on in his presentation when he was talking about reflective versus formative models, is that there's kind of rising consensus that these between person and nomothetic approaches are not actually able to give explanatory weight to the questions that we ask. And there's a lot of reasons why this is true. One of the biggest ones that people often talk about is the fact that psychological data tend to be non-ergodic, which basically just means that the processes that kind of cause between person phenomena are not the same ones that are causing it at the individual level. So what I want to do now is basically at each of these different levels of aggregation, quickly step through and show you some examples of what different types of research questions would look like at these levels of aggregation, with a kind of focus on the idiographic level, which is the largely least explored one. So first of all, a descriptive question within personality that would be between person are these nomothetic personality inventories that we build. So the Big Five is one of the greatest examples of this. It's supposed to define the structure of individual differences within populations. It's been shown across cultures and time and age groups. Also, these normative patterns of change that have been demonstrated across a number of studies, often in 10 plus different longitudinal studies that people have collected over time, are also examples of these kind of descriptive patterns in personality. At the predictive level, there's robust evidence that personality predicts a number of outcomes. In some of my recent work, I actually did 171,000 people across 10 longitudinal studies over decades using propensity score matching and specification curve analysis to look at the robustness, and found that personality predicts a bunch of different outcomes. I looked at 14 specifically, and there's many here that it also predicted that I don't list. So personality is this robust predictor of outcomes. Next, a couple of examples within person. The kind of classical approach of thinking about description within person are these kinds of density distributions. So if we look at personality states that are collected over time for people, we can collect those into a distribution that maybe tells you about someone. And when you look at that across a bunch of different people, what you start to see is that people differ in these density distributions in ways that may actually have some sort of important features for both prediction and elsewise. And finally, in a predictive case, one study looked at how negative affect and rumination, both at the average level and the daily level, predicted sleep quality and disruption, finding that negative affect at both the average daily level, but not rumination, were predictive of both, with negative affect being predictive of worse sleep and more disruptions. But now we can really kind of dive into the meat of what I wanted to talk about, which is thinking about description, prediction, and explanation at the idiographic level. And this is important because you'll see this is the first case where I've highlighted that explanation box, where I think we can finally start to dig into some of these kind of explanatory questions that we want to answer and understand how these psychological phenomena and processes actually unfold. And I think that this is for two main reasons. So the first, I think, was really nicely highlighted in several of the talks. I think for, in Hakim's talk, he was kind of like political ideology is what political ideology test. And similar in personality, something that I frequently think is personality is what personality test, which at its core is quite circular. I mean, a great advantage, for these nomothetic approaches is that you have these kind of core traits that you can examine. But a challenge for this is that this will always be constrained by what trait or traits were measured and the content of those measures, even beyond that. Inventories differ in terms of the items that are included in ways that could have consequences. And that, again, like this circularity that then kind of comes from that. If we look at these individual differences, we define these traits and we build theories around them, makes it difficult to test some of these. And then this creates what I would call a theory method gap between how these theories arise and then the kinds of things that we build around them to test. Because again, we're deriving these and then trying to build a theory as opposed to assuming that we have a reason to think that these should exist. And even if you ask a personality psychologist what they think personality is, they're not going to tell you the big five or extroversion. They're going to tell you dispositions or tendencies or something about patterns. So what do? Well, I want to kind of walk you through an example of what I think would be a more theory-based application that will kind of close that gap. And for me, that always means going back to Gordon Allport. So Gordon Allport is one of the kind of foundational early personality psychologists. And in 1937, he defined personality as a dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his unique adjustments to the environment. And personally, I find that in a sort of shift in the types of ways that we think about this at the idiographic level, because of the kinds of data and things that we have available, this is quite a testable theory. And so I think that the biggest place at which this theory method gap exists, both in personality and across psychology more broadly, is in dynamics. Our theories are dynamic, our methods are often not. And to be fair, this was reasonable up until quite recently, whenever it was very difficult to collect dynamic data. It was expensive. It was in some cases impossible. But now with the advent of smartphones where we can ask people questions, mobile sensing, wearable devices like Apple Watches and Fitbits, and social media, we now have access to huge troughs of dynamic data. And our real question is, how do these fit in with the theories that we have and how can we use them to test them? So now I kind of want to just take the pieces of Gordon Allport's definition and demonstrate how they are proposing descriptive, predictive, and explanatory questions and how we might go about addressing those. So if you imagine that we collected something like experience sampling data on a bunch of people or even on a single person for a long time on a number of different variables, the most simple thing that we could do to try to capture this dynamic organization within that individual would be to just correlate their responses over time. And if you just correlate those responses over time, what you end up with is this asymmetric correlation, the symmetric correlation matrix of how all of their experiences were related to one another over the course of your measurement period. And you can then further represent these using network tools. We'll show you something about how these are interrelated. And when you do this across a bunch of different people, you can start seeing differences in this inter-individual structure that Gordon Allport was talking about. And the features of these differences in structures then can also be used if you want to try to harken back to some of these between-person questions and look at broader outcomes, et cetera. And more than that, I've done this with one experiencing sample study where I had 250 people who did this twice over the course of 2 years. And I constructed these models that looked at their patterns of their experiences and actually showed that there was really, really strong consistency over the course of these 2 years, but there were also these individual differences in that consistency. So the next piece of his definition was of those psychophysical systems. And this starts getting at some of the explanatory aspects through what's called dynamical systems theory, which fundamentally is, well, it's a big field of study, but it's kind of fundamentally about how systems behave. And a big part of how systems behave is that systems tend to like to be at and move towards equilibria. Equilibria basically being the points where systems are happy, the point where they don't want to change. And within systems theory, there's many types of equilibrium, but two of the most common are called attractors and repellers, with attractors kind of pulling a system toward it and repellers kind of pushing the system away from it. And to kind of show you an example of how this kind of applies to personality, we can look at some work by my colleague Alex Danberg and Alex Danvers and his colleagues, who looked at what's called a changes outcome model. And basically the model is this. What you're trying to do is predict change in some variable from an intercept and the level of that variable. And when we do this, you can kind of see how this maps onto the plot, where we have this change in extroversion on the y-axis, and we have level of extroversion on the x-axis. And because we're trying to capture an equilibria, which is going to be whenever the system doesn't want to change, what we want to look at is that point where the change is zero. And we want to try to figure out where that is. And we want to figure out how strongly the system is pulled towards that. So we can basically do that by setting the equation equal to zero, so setting change equal to zero and solving. And when we do that by some simple algebra, we just see that if you want to find the attractor point in that graph, we would just divide the intercept by the slope and then multiply it by -1. If you want to know the strength of that attractor, we see that it's just B1. And once we have defined this, then we can start asking questions about how individual differences in the location and the strength of the attractors and repellers give information about the psychological systems that are core to this definition, or in all course personality definition. So finally, I just want to finish up the definition and say that the last piece was that determine his unique adjustments to his environment. So if these kind of psychophysical systems are determining one's adjustment, then we should be able to predict their behaviors and their responses. Idiographic prediction is actually becoming especially popular in clinical science, where clinicians have been long interested in how individuals differ in the triggers for performing maladaptive behaviors and how those could be disrupted to better clinical care. And I'm just going to talk about one recent examination where Aaron Fisher and his colleague used a number of idiographic experiences, like feeling irritable or angry, and a bunch of other things that you can see here on the screen or in his paper, to predict whether or not these people who were trying to quit smoking smoked and when they did smoke. And basically what they found was that by building these idiographics of individual prediction models, that on average, with these features, they could predict smoking with 80% accuracy. But there was also some variability, with some people achieving perfect predictive accuracy and some people kind of down around more like 50%, that suggest the processes through which people are making this behavior and this behavior is occurring do differ across people. But importantly, they were still predictable. So just kind of bringing it back, the goal here was just to kind of walk you through a kind of attempt to close this theory method gap through the study of dynamics and through dynamic models by starting with this definition that Gordon Allport preferred and giving examples. But my broader goal in this talk was really just to kind of put the research that personality does, and hopefully the research that outside of psychology is also being done, in the kind of context of thinking about how do we need to aggregate the data? What kinds of questions can we answer with that? And what question best matches our goal or our theoretical predictions? With that, I just want to say thank you. On my OSF page, you'll find the slides for this talk, as well as a bunch of suggested papers for those who want to dig more deeply, since I had to be very high level. You can also contact me in my email or on Twitter. I just want to say thank you to my colleague, Josh Jackson.